You are listening to the 44th broadcast of TBR Radio's, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed calls Colonel Edwin Kennedy, retired professor of military history at the Army Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas. They discuss the Cold War fought between the United States and the old Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. And the current Cold Wars with Russia and China.
Kennedy.
Sir.
How are you doing today?
Good. I'm sorry I missed you. We were at the courthouse filing a lawsuit against our county for moving our Confederate monument, and it took me longer than I expected it to.
Oh, you were doing God's work. So tell me how is that going? How is that lawsuit going, and how is the monument removal going? I saw the news reports of it earlier this week.
Well, we put an emergency TRO, temporary restraining order on them. The judge, we have no idea why, went with the county, did not read the law, and violated the law. It's very clear that our monument does not meet the requirements that are set forth in order to get a waiver. They claimed they sent a request to move the monument waiver to Montgomery, which they did. But because the waiver was not predicated on the law, it was just a waiver request, not fitting the requirements of the law, the monument committee refused to hear or to act on it and send it back. So we are not going to consider an illegitimate waiver. If it met the requirements, we would look at it, but it didn't. So the city, or the county, is very, very clever. They're catering to Black Lives Matter. So what they did is they said, in 90 days, if it hadn't been acted on, we move it. Well, the law does not say that. It does not say that. It says if the waiver is not acted on in 90 days for monuments less than 40 years old, our monument's 115, then it can be considered approved. But because ours, and they won't say this in the news, they keep skipping that part of the law, our monument does not meet the regulatory requirements for a waiver. So we put the TRO in saying they're violating the law, they know they're doing it, and they're trying to use information warfare by repeating, oh yes, we're following the 90-day rule. Well, the rule does not apply. And the judge obviously did not read the law, or she's up for re-election. So we now have filed another suit this morning for a hearing, which we're supposed to get, and asking them to return the monument, which probably won't happen, but we're going to embarrass the snot out of them and tell the taxpayers they paid $58,000 to move that monument to the cemetery a mile away, and it will not change a single thing going on in our county. Nothing. It's just to appease Black Lives Matter.
Well, are you really going to appease Black Lives Matter, or do you think that it's just a matter of time before they start protesting the fact that there's a Confederate monument in the cemetery?
The answer is yes. It's not even going to appease them. They think they're appeasing them. They think the problem's going away. Black Lives Matter representative on the news the other day said, we've won a small victory, now we can go on to bigger things. So what they're going to do is, yes, the answer is yes, they're going to go and continue to go against the monuments. They said they would. NAACP in 1991 in their proclamation said they're going after flags, monuments, cemetery markers, and of all the doggone things, reenactments. They don't want any war reenactments. They stopped one in Georgia a couple of weeks ago because it was held on a Boy Scout camp land. The Scouts refused to let them do it anymore. It's been doing it for 30 years, and they refused it because NAACP went after them and Black Lives Matter. So this is just the beginning. I'm telling them, you've done what Neville Chamberlain did, and you're hoping for a different result.
You know, I'm going to throw something out there because I think you're referring to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement, but Let's just assume for a second that Chamberlain would have maintained the prime ministership of England, and that, was it King Edward, would not have abdicated the throne, because I really don't believe that he was forced to abdicate because he was divorced, or he was marrying a divorced American woman. I think he was forced to abdicate because he didn't want war in Europe, and other parties did. And so assuming that Edward could have maintained the throne and that Chamberlain could have maintained the prime ministership, is it possible World War II might have never been fought at all?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That is a very good question. I don't know. You're right about that. That's a good point. Don't know.
But so tell us, is there anything else going on the heritage front in Alabama right now that you're involved with?
Well, we started a group in July, and what we did is the SCV and UDC was they weren't coordinated in what they were doing. They were each doing their stuff mainly at the local level, but they weren't coordinating across the county boundaries and stuff. And unfortunately, what we hear has effects in Montgomery and southern Alabama. So he said, let's start an organization that coordinates all these groups together, and we can share information, which we're doing now. We have lawyers across Alabama sharing this information. We weren't doing that before. It was an uncoordinated effort, which meant they piece in detail fights in one county when they go to the other. The Black Lives Matter group will get their cars and come here and somewhere else, fight us, and then go to another side. We need a comprehensive plan. So we started a group called Heritage Protection of Alabama. It's a loose coalition of United Daughters of the Confederacy, the SCV, unofficially, and heritage protection people, historians across North Alabama. And so what we're doing now is sharing information constantly, updating people what's going on in one place that they in another, so that we know, what works and what doesn't. And one of the things we found out is the monuments are being moved because people without legal standing are filing the suits. In other words, the Sons of Confederate Veterans have no legal standing. We don't own the monuments. They were purchased by the UDC. So the UDC is the one that has to have the standing to file the complaints. They are very, very, very hesitant to do that. I don't know what's going on with UDC. They've lost their spines in a lot of cases, but we have great UDC groups here, but they're afraid to go against the national. They said, we'll lose our charter. And it's sad, but, the national level UDC is just going there, don't want to make an issue of it. And I think their grandmothers and great-grandmothers would be very disappointed. But we have a couple of UDC ladies right here that are tigers. The new president of our local UDC and one of our members who is a hardcore Confederate. She is outstanding. She has gone and signed all the court documents, and she's also a researcher, so she found the paperwork that shows the UDC owned the monument. A lot of these towns have no workers, that the UDC owns it, so the courts are saying you have no standing if you can't show that it's yours. So we have found the documents saying that the monument here belonged to the UDC, and the interesting thing is it was published in open source in the newspaper, the big paper here, with the county commissioner in 1968 saying that the monument belongs to the UDC, so there's a public record of it. So that gives us standing where a lot of these suits are being thrown out of court. They have no standing. We do.
So when do you expect to hear, for example, having a court date scheduled, or to hear some kind of a feedback on the lawsuit that you filed today?
Well, we're on the document we were given back last Thursday night when we filed our emergency suit. the judge who ruled against us said, you will be given a hearing by another judge, and you'll be notified. Well, we haven't been notified yet, which is good, but we wanted to file this suit before the hearing, and so we're expecting our lawyer will be notified in the next couple of days of a hearing date.
And so are your lawyers working pro bono, or how are you paying these lawyers?
We're getting a professional discount because he's a Southerner. No, we're having to raise funds. We get our hands out, we pass the hat, and amazingly, people are being very generous. We have members of our Sons of Veterans, UDC, and people who are just good Southerners are sending us checks saying, please use this towards our legal defense fund.
So,
we're eventually going to have to figure where the stop point is. We can't, it costs a lot of money to take this up, and we could eventually end up at the Supreme Court. According to the lawyer, he said we have a good chance on appeal. But, the problem is we don't have the kind of money we need.
So let's talk about the Cold War in Germany from 1945 to 1991. That was...
Yes, sir.
That was number 10 of the list of the top 12. And so how did the Cold War in Germany... It's not really a battle. I don't even know that it's really a campaign. It's, it was an ongoing action, and, it's again, it was a Cold War. It wasn't really a war in the traditional sense. No shots were being fired per se. How did it make the top 12 list?
Because it was so significant in our military history that we won based on projecting strength, not weakness, and we never had to go to war. Which we were fighting wars around the globe, and I'm trying to think of the doggone word, proxy wars. The Soviet proxies were fighting us. Vietnam was a proxy war by the Soviets. And what we thought is, starting in 1946, when things started turning really bad in Germany, to the point that we knew the Soviets were our new enemies, what we feared is it was going to be a major war in Europe. And so the Soviets didn't want to go head-to-head with us in Europe. Fear of escalation to nuclear conflict was certainly a part of it. But when we started reinforcing Europe in the late 1940s and early 50s, trying to achieve somewhat of a parity, and then using tactical nuclear weapons as a backup, because we couldn't match the Soviets in power on the ground, but we could match them technically with nuclear weapons. Then they said, well, it's not worth it here, let's go somewhere else.
So explain for our listeners, what is the difference between a Cold War and a regular war?
Well, a Cold War is you're posed toe-to-toe, facing across the line at each other with your weapons ready to go, but you don't do anything. You're using other elements of national power to affect the other side. So we're not shooting, which means it's not hot. But when you pull the trigger, you have then initiated a hot war. So we had a hot war in Korea from 1966 to 69 with the North Koreans killing a bunch of American GIs there. We were fighting against them, but it wasn't a full-scale conventional war. It was irregular warfare. They were using guerrillas across lines and infiltrate into South Korea to kill American soldiers, but there was a shooting going on. So, that was almost a hot war. I'd say if you were in Korea along the DMZ, it was a hot war back then, from 66 to 69. Vietnam was a hot war. There was full-scale combat going on. It was mostly conventional war, heavily weighted towards unconventional guerrilla warfare. But remember, when South Vietnam fell, it was a massive invasion, conventional war. The North Vietnamese tried a couple of times to do a conventional war, and it failed. So they went back to guerrilla warfare. It's part of Mao's theory of war that if you can't win guerrilla war, or if you win the guerrilla war, that's great, but if you can't, then you transition to something else. And they kept transitioning. They go to a large-scale conventional war, they get whacked. So in 1972, for instance, the Easter Offensive, when they invaded South Vietnam with massive ground combat forces from the north, it went hot, and we beat them down, and then we pulled out. Remember, January of 73, we were gone. And the Congress pulled the rug out from under the Vietnamese. We had promised to provide air support, and then the Congress said, we're not doing that. So Nixon's promise to support South Vietnam went away, and they rolled over the South Vietnamese in 75 and won by a conventional invasion, not guerrilla warfare.
So, Yalta, Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt got together, smoked some cigarettes, drank some cheap booze, and chopped up Europe. But by the time it actually came time to chop up Germany, Roosevelt was dead. And I'm going to guess that whatever agreement was made at Yalta had not been ratified by the Senate and therefore was not a binding treaty. So, knowing in 1945 that the Russians were going to be the next enemy, and George Patton couldn't have made that any clearer, why were the Russians allowed to basically, quote-unquote, liberate a significant part of Germany and basically chop the city of Berlin and the country of Germany in half and basically take half of it for themselves? Why didn't the Americans and the British just keep Germany?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a number of answers to that, but I'll try to keep it simple. There's a great book out that Diana West wrote just a couple of years ago. It's called American Betrayal. It is fabulous. It is extremely, extremely well documented. The name of the book, full title is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character by Diana West. If you read no other books about what went on back then, this is one. Actually, the book's been out for 7 years now. I thought it was a couple of years ago, but time's going so fast. Diana West explains how in the 1920s and well into the Roosevelt administration, the communists were able to infiltrate our government and influence our national decision-making on the highest levels. It is extremely well documented. Now, here's the clincher. When the Soviet Union fell back in the early 90s, they opened up their national archives, which was very unusual. Because of glasnost, openness, they opened it up. It stayed open for about 2, maybe 3 years at the most. During that time, people flocked to the Soviet Union to do research, and they found incredible stuff. All the stuff that McCarthy had claimed about communist infiltration, hot dog, guess what? He was right. People didn't like the way he acted, but he was right. The infiltrators all in our government, and the Soviets had their names in their archives. So Diana West goes into the detail how they influenced post-war Germany and what happened there. And it's awful. It's sad. We caused our own problem, the whole war in Europe, by giving the farm away to the Soviets. They ran over us. And Roosevelt was complicit.
Because by the time the war was coming to an end, Roosevelt was already dead, and so there was a whole new administration in place, and to some degree even a different, civilian leadership over the military and so forth. So why was the Yalta Agreement honored? Why not just go ahead and just do what was expedient at that time?
Because the vice president was Theodore Truman, who was a Roosevelt protege, and deep state was already established. Those communists started infiltrating in 1933. They were the deep state in 1945. They had been that government, and Harry Hopkins was a key pro-communist American leader. He was the alter ego to Roosevelt. Everything Roosevelt did And this is fascinating when you read Diana West's book. I highly recommend the book. It's an easy read, but I always go to the endnotes in the books and the bibliography first. And she has done amazing research on that book to show how deep the communist infiltration had been allowed to occur under Roosevelt. And Harry Hopkins was the guy that let the door open.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
So, given the fact that there's a Marxist resurgence in America today, and its biggest cheerleaders seem to be the very creatures that we refer to now as the swamp, is it possible that communist infiltration was never truly rooted out? That it's, if anything, it's been in our government for these 50, 60, 70 years now, and it's just dug itself deeper?
Yes, absolutely. It was never rooted out. Because what they try to do, and this is communist doctrine, humiliate the other side, trying to show the light in the rat hole. And that's what they've done. You know, every time, you know, it's like Senator, help me out, I just said his name.
McCarthy?
It was McCarthy. You know, they ruined him. They tried to, you know, make it look like he was, you know, wearing a tinfoil hat. The guy was absolutely right. The way he did it might not have been amenable to our process, but he was right. And these, when they could have rooted it out, they went back and said, "Oh, shame on us for being slow to these people. They're just they're social democrats. They're liberals, but not really communists." Wrong. A lot of them were either pro-communist or communist. Then people were shamed. They didn't want to go after them, except for people like Reagan. But they are deeply entrenched now.
So Richard Nixon was on the committee there with McCarthy, and he was one of, I think one of the reasons why Eisenhower picked him as vice president was because Nixon had unimpeachable anti-communist credentials. And so why didn't the rooting out of communism, why didn't it happen in earnest when Richard Nixon was president? In other words, you know, Donald Trump said he was going to try to drain the swamp. Why didn't Richard Nixon try to drain the swamp?
Because of what happened in Burma. They professionally and personally ruined him. And so people got away from pointing out the communists because they were considered McCarthyites if they did so. And everyone said, I don't want to be that whack-a-mole that puts my head up and says there's communists over here because they'll McCarthyize me.
So,
and I think they knew, especially when Vietnam got the communist influence. You had people, you know, that were pro-communist getting away with it. Could you imagine with people, Nazis? Fonda is my favorite example. Going to North Vietnam with some of the other leftists in our government, going to visit the North Vietnamese who were fighting against, that's incredible. If that had been Nazi Germany, people would go nuts. But, you know, communists, they're okay. I'm vicious, of course.
Mm-hmm. So you had listed this Cold War as starting in 1945. So that means that the Cold War had actually begun while we were still technically allied with the Soviet Union. Would that be correct?
I think technically you could say that, yes, because the Soviets were working against us hard during World War II, stealing our secrets, getting nuclear technology. And again, I refer back to Dr. West's research on this. I think her research is impeccable. I mean, I look at the sources and what she referenced and cross-referenced, and a lot of that stuff covered up. But it's, she obviously had put it out in the open. But they were stealing our nuclear technology with the approval of the Roosevelt administration.
I wrote an article recently for the Barnes Review, and it was about a Japanese submarine. It was called the I-400, and it was basically an underwater aircraft carrier.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And at the end of the war, the Japanese had built 3 of these things, and they were supposed to be taken to an island somewhere, and they were supposed to be broken down and examined. They were surrendered to the United States Navy, and they were supposed to be examined. But there were certain people in the Navy who were afraid that the Soviets would get a glimpse of these things, and they didn't want the technology to fall into the hands of the Soviets. And supposedly, the Soviets were already sending an envoy to Hawaii to examine these submarines when they got there. And so what happened was the Navy took these 3 submarines off the coast of Japan somewhere. They scuttled the 3 submarines, and that was the end of it. But what we found out however many years later was that that's not actually what happened. That's what the world was told had happened. So then, of course, the Soviets left Hawaii. They went home. And the British and the Americans examined these submarines in a secret location and then scuttled the ships off the coast of Hawaii. And so there were people in the Navy in 1945 who were afraid to share military secrets with the Soviets, even though they were our allies. So,
yep.
And obviously there were people in the Army who, at least Patton and some others, had those same precautions. And so why is it that something like an underwater aircraft carrier could be kept secret from the Soviets because that was considered a military expediency, but yet we would give them our nuclear secrets? And again, we know that it happened. I'm just trying to wrap my head around a few things. Help me do that.
Okay. It's because it's compartmentalized. What the War Department and the Navy Department were doing in 1945-46 was compartmentalized from what was going on in the United States under the auspices of State Department and official policy. They were hiding it from Truman and Roosevelt. I'm sure that Truman or Roosevelt was dead when this happened, because by the end of the war, when we had submarines, Roosevelt was gone. Truman was in charge, so they compartmentalized it. Remember, Truman didn't even know there was a nuclear weapons program, that we had a bomb, until he became the president. And they said, "Hey, Mr. President, we got to tell you something that you didn't know about." So it was compartmentalized. A lot of the stuff wasn't known, wasn't shared information. And I think there's people in the military that were concerned that we didn't need to tell the president everything. I mean, he didn't need to know about submarines. It would be nice if he knew it, maybe, but it wasn't essential that he knew about it. So they were able to do that without telling the president, so that he would spill beans to the Soviets. And at the end of the war, we were starting very quickly to see by the middle of 1945, the Soviets really weren't going to be our friend. And by that time, the nuclear stuff had already been given to them 2 years prior to that by the government.
So what was going on? You mentioned, of course, this is the beginning of the Cold War. 1991, you say, was the end of the Cold War. So what were the events that ended the Cold War?
Well, I think there's a number of them, but one of them is we outspent the Soviets in defense. The thing that scared, I think, from what I know, scared the Soviets the most was the Space Force technology. When Reagan said we're going to get this super technology that prevents missiles or rockets from hitting the I think that just scared the snot out of Soviets. They were going bankrupt. They had spent all those years in Afghanistan, from 79 till 89, fighting a war they couldn't win in Afghanistan. They were going broke from that. It was costing them a mint. It was costing them in people, and the Soviet people did not really like that war in Afghanistan. They could see it for what it was. It was not a war of liberation. It was a war of conquest to impose Soviet government on the Afghans. So those things combined with the fact that NATO facing the Warsaw Pact, they weren't going to win that way. They finally were falling apart and said, okay, we give up. The Soviets collapsed. So in December of 91, they just fell apart and left the republics that had been forced into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They spun off into their own nations, as many of them did.
So, the Cold War, how do you know when it ends? A regular war, obviously, everybody on the other side is dead. Okay, we won. Or the other side signs a treaty. Okay, the war's over. But a Cold War, how do you officially know to declare it to be over?
It's when we say it is.
Okay. And you look at the relationship between the United States and Russia today, and particularly between the media in the United States and certain people within the government of the United States and Vladimir Putin today. Is it safe to say that we're in another Cold War with Russia?
Absolutely. World War I ended without a peace treaty. It ended with an armistice. And 20 years later, we're back at it again. Same type of situation.
And
it's not an exact analogy. I'm just saying, we thought the war would end all wars, in 1919 when we went to sign the treaties was, the final word. The arbiter was the United States coming in and adding the combat power to force the Germans out the war. That didn't end it. It was an uneasy armistice, which took only 20 years for the Germans to come back in full fury.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
And so is it also safe to assume that we're in a Cold War with China right now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. War by other means, we're using other elements of national power. The political, especially the economic warfare. They're fighting us economically, stealing us, undercutting us. They can use slave labor to make stuff cheaper and undercut our production. So Walmart, is helping the communist Chinese get richer by selling Chinese stuff, and undercutting American products, American-made products.
So go ahead and break down from 1945 to 1991. Obviously, you're not going to probably be able to give us every incident that happened, but, I guess give me the highlights of the Cold War.
The Berlin airlift, 1948, when the Soviets cut off Berlin, trying to force us out of West Berlin. That was a major impact because it was the red flag that said the war is on for sure. Now, of course, Winston Churchill had already given his speech at the little college up in Missouri. The name just escaped me. I've been there before. But he said, there's a wall an Iron Curtain dropping across Eastern Europe, he recognized what happened, but the Berlin airlift was the red flag that immediately ran up. The next thing that happened of real note was the fact that the military alliances, with NATO forming the alliances against the Soviet bloc, then the economic war began, in that time frame. The nuclear war, or nuclear race, the Soviets getting their nuclear weapons in 49. Then hot dog, it goes hot in 1950 with the Soviets and the Communist Chinese, both supporting North Korea's armed invasion of the South. That was a scary thing because people all of a sudden said, wow, now we have a hot war. This is the Soviet, the communists. 5 years after we were friends with them, or allies, not friends, allies in World War II, now they are going after us. So in 1950, the fighting was going, but really it started in Vietnam. Before that, 1945, the communists had moved in to fill the power vacuum for the French. The French were already fighting, that colonial war against the communists. And then after Korea, all this stuff started picking up in the former colonies of France and Britain in Africa. They went from Indochina to Algeria to fight the communists in Algeria. And then the British were fighting, communist-inspired insurgencies in Africa. All this stuff, was going on, proxy wars against the Soviets. In the meantime, Soviet strength in East Germany never went down. The Soviets maintained huge presence, whereas we brought our soldiers home after World War II. We had to rebuild our army, in the late 40s to stand up to what we figured would be a Soviet armed invasion of Europe. So, the proxy wars, the Eastern Europe business, where we had to go back and rebuild our military because we thought it would matter while Korea was being invaded. We had to, replace all the armed forces we took out, rebuild it in Europe. And we kept them there until the mid-1990s when we started downsizing and bring them home.
Let me do this because the sound quality has been degrading for the last couple minutes. So let me hang up on you right now, and I'm going to call you right back, okay?
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
How you hear me now? I'm going to stay in this other room.
Okay, yeah, you sound better now.
Okay, good.
So the Cold War wasn't just going on in Germany, though, from 1941 to 1945. I mean, it was going on pretty much between the United States and between the Russians or the Soviets worldwide.
Oh, yeah. I have a British Army friend who was my office mate at the infantry school back in the early 1980s. He served as a lieutenant in Aden, and he was an SAS officer then. He was fighting against the communist insurgents in Aden.
So when you were teaching about the Cold War, when you were a professor of military history at the Army Staff College, what were the teaching points?
You're asking me for instant recall? That's a dangerous thing with Alzheimer's. I think the teaching points primarily were this was a war that had to be executed using all elements of national power, not just military. We had to, diplomatic information, military and economic, to fight against that threat, because it wasn't just a military threat. The bad guys were using information warfare against us, definitely using economic warfare against us, and definitely diplomatic. We had to fight them on all those fronts. And then we had to meet them militarily, places like Vietnam.
So now that you've mentioned Vietnam, or let's even go a little bit before Vietnam, let's look at Korea. And so we call this a Cold War, you say, because there's not actually shooting going on. That would make it a hot war. But there was shooting going on in Korea, and there was shooting going on in Vietnam. So was it really a Cold War, not a hot one?
Well, I guess, you can. It's kind of regional, but we looked at the Soviet Union as our primary competitor. So we weren't shooting Soviets directly. We were shooting them indirectly. They were using proxies to fight us. So we weren't fighting the Soviets, but they were our main competitor. When we stopped fighting the Communist Chinese in 1953, then we went into a Cold War with them until 1972 when Nixon opened up Communist China.
There's that.
Relative. You're right. It's all relative. If you're in Vietnam, it was not a Cold War. It was definitely a hot war.
And you look at the Don Vito Corleone principle, which I think that he probably read in The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which is keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And so Nixon opening up China, do you think that was really an alliance, or that was just keeping your enemies closer?
Well, it's interesting he did that, because at the timing, and while I'm not a big fan of opening up to Communist China, it had to do with politics. Remember, the Soviets and the Communist Chinese were really, by 1970, becoming mortal enemies with each other. They were very, very much at each other's throats. And they were both supporting North Vietnam against us and the North Koreans. But they had the big fight on the Ussuri River. They were becoming competitors in that region. And so it took a long time for that rift to heal, and I would say they've healed now, and they're back to where they were. They're chums again. But Nixon took advantage of that fissure that occurred between the Communist Chinese and the Soviets to insert ourselves, which is very smart, because the Chinese became closer to us. They became our BFFs, and the Soviets were held at arm's length. So Nixon was clever. He was using the Communist Chinese against the Soviets.
So, fast forward however many years. And if we can play nice with China, be it keeping our enemies closer or be it a genuine friendship, either way, if we could play nice with China, why is it that we could never learn to play nice with the Russians?
Well, we can't play nice with the Chinese either. We've learned that the communists, the ends justify the means. Remember, they're not a Judeo-Christian ethic. They will lie, lie, lie. They break treaties like they're saltine crackers. They will tell you what you want to hear. And remember, these are the Sun Tzu people. They will tell you what you want to hear, and they will use everything at their disposal to win. And so it's naive to think that you can deal with them like you deal with another Western power. They don't think like we do. And the Soviets don't either. Soviets aren't Western Europeans. They look like them. They dress like them. They try to act like them, but they are very much different. And so they're not Judeo-Christian ethic people. They will lie to you in a heartbeat to get what they need. And everyone needs to understand that. They will break a treaty in a heartbeat, and they've been doing it. And we're suckers. We fall for it. Trump has finally called them out and said, hey, you're not following the treaties we signed with in the 80s on nuclear weapons. Treaties off, deals off. It's not a one-sided thing. And the Soviets and the Chinese, red Chinese, not the nationalists are our friends, but the red Chinese, the communist Chinese, will do whatever's necessary to win. They will lie, cheat, steal, and that's what they've been doing with our technology. You look at their airplanes and all their new technology, man, looks like our stuff. No wonder they stole the plans for it. They are bad people.
So if you had to take your pick, if you had to pick one or the other, in other words, you know what they say, politics makes strange bedfellows.
Yeah.
But, you know, or who was it? Was it Juan Seguin at the Alamo who said, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend"?
Yeah.
You know, sometimes war and politics, you know, cause you to make strange and unusual alliances that you would not otherwise make. If you had to pick one, and you had to trust them with your life, at least in the short term. In other words, you had two foxholes, and you had to jump in one or the other. Would you jump in Russia or would you jump in China?
You put me in a hard place. I'd jump in with the Vietnamese.
Okay.
The Vietnamese hate the Chinese. I mean, they fought a war in '79 after we got out, and the Chinese went to war with them over the northern border dispute. And the Vietnamese do not trust the Chinese because the Chinese have gone in there and done bad things to them for centuries. They know that the Chinese are the way they are. So I facetiously say the Vietnamese. That's not an answer to your question. I wouldn't jump with either one. I'd stay out in the open.
Okay, and I'm going to give you another hypothetical.
Yeah.
Let's pretend for just a second that you're an advisor to Kim Jong-un. And Chairman Kim is very quickly realizing, and I think he's been realizing for the last few years now, that he probably cannot trust China or Russia. Or at least that his relationships with those countries aren't what he had thought they were, and maybe even what his father and grandfather thought that they were. And so if you were North Korea and you had to jump in with one or the other, would you jump in with China or would you jump in with Russia? Or would you just basically cut ties with both?
The North Koreans, because of ethnic issues and culture, I think we'll go with the Chinese every time.
And
remember that the Chinese had Koreans in the Communist Chinese army that fought against the Japanese. When the war was over and the Communist Chinese won in '49, those same soldiers that had been in the Chinese army that were ethnic Koreans were sent back to Korea to fight for the North Koreans. You didn't see that with the Soviets.
Mm-hmm. I know that North Korea shares a border with China, and maps can be deceptive. But the map makes Pyongyang and Vladivostok look pretty close to one another. Maybe they're not.
Well, they are. But culturally, the Chinese and the North Koreans share much closer cultural ties. And the fact that the North Koreans had fought, thousands of those soldiers had fought for the Communist Chinese, not for the Soviets in Soviet Union, I think there's a long memory there.
Well, I know we're getting off subject from the Cold War between the Americans and the Soviets, but just talking about Cold Wars in general, there's been a Cold War between the Koreas that's been going on since 1953. And as I understand it, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un could have negotiated the end of that war at the summit there in Vietnam, but basically John Bolton and Mike Pompeo stepped in and killed that deal. And so why is it that there are certain people in this country that are insistent on maintaining a Cold War between the Koreas?
Because you can't trust anything the North Koreans say. They've broken every single treaty.
Could you argue, though, that the South Koreans know the North Koreans better than we do? And it seems that the South Korean president seems pretty eager to enter into an agreement with the North.
He's trying to make a name for himself. His family came from North Korea, And, you know, his legacy, he wants to be the guy who, you know, reunites the Koreans, but he's playing with fire. The North Koreans will mop him up like a cheap mop, and he will not even know it, because he is so open that he's overlooking what they've done in the past. He's so open to talking to them and having some sort of victory that he doesn't care. He needs to be very careful. They will use him.
So there's a Cold War in Korea, but yet there are cultural exchanges that take place between the two. Here in the last Olympics, they had joint teams that played together. You know, there was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and yet there were still a number of cultural and academic exchanges that took place. You know, when you're in an active, hot war with somebody, you don't do those things. So, you know, kind of explain the difference in dynamic there, and how it is that you could be at war with somebody and yet still trade with that person, essentially now trading with the enemy, or giving foreign aid to the enemy, as in, you know, all of the wheat that was shipped from Kansas to Moscow for however many decades. When I was a kid, I never could understand that. I remember asking my grandfather in the early 80s, you know, why we're watching on the news that the United States is sending however many tons and tons of wheat to Russia. It's like, aren't they supposed to be our enemy, kind of thing. So yeah. Explain that dynamic, how in some ways you're very much at war with somebody, yet in other ways you're very much normal in your relations with them.
Well, it's about the politics and the money. We had surplus we needed to get rid of, and we didn't mind taking Soviet money for it. We're not, you know, we had to kind of hold our noses and say, okay, we'll sell you this wheat. We know that's helping you, but we'll take your money because we have excess. We don't want to dump it in the field and let it rot. That hurts our farmers. So we were willing to hold our noses and sell the wheat to them. And these cultural exchanges, the idea is open your country so they can see, you know, what our country's like. Of course, we have military personnel from other countries come to train here in the United States. And it's all year long we have these people. And you've seen in the news where the Saudi Arabian officer that murdered those Navy people a little over a year ago now was one of those exchanges. Now, we know Saudi Arabia is a repressive regime. We know they're bad, but we want to influence them by allowing them in to see our country. A lot of it has to do with politics, and the State Department runs those exchange programs, not the military. They choose who comes, so the military has to take them. And I trained hundreds of foreign military personnel at Fort Leavenworth at Command and General Staff College. They come there because we're trying to teach them our way of life. We don't care what their grades are. Now, some of them are very competitive, like the Europeans and some of the Asian countries, the Koreans, and the soldiers from Singapore are very, very competitive. And this is a ticket for them to become high-ranking officers in their armies. But a lot of them, like the Arab students, don't care. They come to have a good time, especially the Saudis. They don't give a hoot, and they cheat, and they do bad things, and they cover it up because State Department didn't want them getting in trouble. So they have speeding tickets, they conduct assaults, they steal stuff. I mean, it's awful, but it's all covered up because it's part of our program to promote diplomacy and democracy in their countries. And so we let them come, to our schools. But I could tell you some really interesting stories. It's just we want to get an inside loop to their high-ranking officers, because these guys in 5-10 years will be high-ranking officers in their military. We want them to be our friends so that we can deal with them.
So I'm going to ask you a crazy question, given the movie that's about to hit the theaters. When you were teaching these Saudi Arabian students at the Army Staff College, did you basically have a class full of Borats?
No, they weren't that funny.
Okay.
Some of them had no sense of humor at all. It's a different mindset. For example, before the students start the regular year, we give them a 2-week course to prep them for the course they're going to go to. And we teach them about U.S. military, our tactical symbols, and, we have little classes that we expose them to make it easier when they get into the regular course so they can kind of understand what's going on. We teach them some of the terminology. And so in the classes, I always like to use a little bit of humor, but you have to be careful with the humor because not everybody sees things the way we do in the Western mindset. So as an example, years ago, I was teaching in our military, we have armored cavalry units. And they're called armored cavalry because they do what the horse cavalry used to do in the Army, only they use armored vehicles. So we have armored reconnaissance units that conduct reconnaissance. Armored cavalry units do cavalry missions, but they're not horse cavalry. But believe it or not, 25 years ago at least, 30 years ago when I was teaching this stuff to these new officers coming to our course, some of the Army still used horse cavalry. So to start off my cavalry operations class, I put a slide of a horse up with all the parts. I said, at the end of the course, you're going to have to name all these parts. Well, the British and Canadians, the Australians go, ha-ha, funny. We know that's not true, but they had a sense of humor. They could laugh. Some of the students were actually drawing pictures of horses and listing the parts down. I said, stop, it's a joke. We don't have horses in the Army anymore. So you have to be careful. The other thing is I show Monty Python clips to illustrate a point. The Australians, the British, and the Canadians would break into a howl. They'd laugh because they understood it was all satire. Some of the guys, like the Saudi Arabians, sit there stone-faced look at you. They didn't get it. They had no clue what the clip was about. So, you have to be careful with the humor because some of them just were not in the same frame of mind.
So when you were in the Army during this Cold War period, was there anything or any things that you were doing that you were consciously aware of at that time that you were actively fighting in a Cold War?
Absolutely. Security was very important. Not letting our operational security be compromised, and that meant, like in Germany, I got into the habit. When you were a kid, you were told to answer the phone, state your name. Hi, this is the Taylor residence. This is Joey. Can I help you, please? Well, you had to learn that when you went to Germany because the East Germans and Soviets were actively collecting intelligence on us. They wanted to know who we were, where we lived, what our hours were. Things that you take for granted here, you had to be very careful of. So you got to the point in Germany, they told you never use your name when you answer the phone because they didn't want to verify if it was an East German or Soviet agent calling you. They wanted to know what your number was, where you lived. So you had to keep all that stuff classified. You didn't give it out. You had to be very careful about your hours, where you went, who you spoke to. They were actively collecting intelligence on us.
That is where we are going to end today's TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour because we are essentially out of time. I want to thank Colonel Kennedy for being our guest again today. I always enjoy the conversation that he and I have at the end of every month. Next month, we will be talking again with Colonel Kennedy, and the subject of conversation will be the Vietnam War and the fake news that was generated by the Vietnam War. But until then, I'd like to encourage you to go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org. If you're not already a subscriber, you can become one, and you can also get your hands on a copy of the jam-packed, supersized September-October issue of the Barnes Review. Do that quickly because here in another week, the November-December issue of the Barnes Review will be coming out. You'll want to check that out as well. But that would become the first issue to new subscribers, and you definitely want to get your hands on a copy of the September-October issue. Next week, same time, same place, I will be back again. But until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless, and I will talk to you again next week.